Hi guys, welcome to the 2x e-commerce podcast show. I say this over and over again. This is the podcast, yes, dedicated to rapid growth in online retail. So if you're looking to increase traffic, conversions, and automate these sales, tune in to the next 30 to 60, sometimes 90 minutes, and you will get a ton of value. You could have takeaways to implement in your stores or your store to blow things up. Now, have I talked about this? I've talked a lot about UX in the past, but I haven't talked specifically about this topic, which is the checkout. It's the final frontier in the entire experience. I haven't actually talked about checkouts in training sessions, in other training sessions, but that's for another story. So essentially, the backstory is that most retailers are focused in engaging shoppers at the top of funnel, and when I mean top of funnel, I mean top of funnel on-site and off-site, but optimizing marketing and website experiences and building awareness to brands and products obviously will drive and compel shoppers to buy. But what happens at the bottom of funnel at checkouts? Are you delivering the right experience? Now, a lot of people running e-commerce stores just leave the box standard checkout, whatever checkout setup is there, they just stick with it. Now, my guest on today is the head of product at a startup, at a company that's rethinking and reimagining the checkout process. The name of the company is called Bolt, right? And their goal is to make sure nothing gets in the way when shoppers decide to make a purchase. So essentially, they're trying to reduce friction at checkouts, okay? And essentially, yeah, that's it. So what I'd like to talk about with this, what we're going to be talking about, what you guys are going to experience, over this this episode really is checkout best practices and what you should be doing at the bottom of funnel in your checkout. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Greiner to the show. Welcome, Greg.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Before we kick off today's show, I'd like to give a quick shout out to our sponsors. Did you know that cloud-hosted e-commerce platforms like Shopify and BigCommerce do not provide automatic backups? Rewind steps in to protect Shopify and BigCommerce stores with automatic backups. Rewind is trusted by over 25,000 stores. Install Rewind and get to test it for free over 7 days. And to extend the 7-day trial to 30 days, head over to rewind.io, their website, and mention 2x eCommerce.
Fantastic. I probably haven't done Bolt as a platform sufficient justice in terms of like the introduction and yourself. So could you take the next minute or two to introduce yourself and then Bolt?
Sure. I think you did a great job introing it, but I'll try to add some context and color. My name is Greiner. I lead the product team at Bolt. I've been at the company for a little over a year. And I come from a relatively extensive e-commerce background. I started an e-commerce company about 10 years ago called Bob's Watches, which really introduced me to a lot of the challenges that come with building a really seamless end-to-end e-commerce experience and all the different components that go into it. So that's what really got me excited about Bolt is Bolt is trying to solve those problems, not just for an individual retailer in the context of an individual retailer, but for retailers at scale. And checkout is a problem when you go and talk to retailers across e-commerce. Something that they don't think about much, right? It's something that they know is challenging. They know it's an issue. They know it's not as good as it could be, but oftentimes are at loss for how to improve it or where they can make investments. And that's really where Bolt comes in. We take over that kind of responsibility for the retailer. We're constantly optimizing the checkout experience for them. And in a lot of ways, we become essentially their checkout optimization team. And we add the ability for them to offer that really seamless experience without having to completely build it themselves.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. How long has Vault been around for?
So the product itself publicly launched almost about 3 years ago. The company has been around for a bit longer than that. It took quite a while to both kind of align on this product market fit, and also once we kind of had discovered the problem we wanted to solve, also build the solution. There were actually a couple of years of just pure development that went in before we even launched our first offering publicly.
Interesting. Okay, so let's jump right into the checkout process. Why is our checkout or the checkout experience so complicated?
For sure. So checkout really sits at the center of the e-commerce experience. It's when the kind of e-commerce experience transitions from the intent to purchase something to the actual purchase and order. And so you have all of the kind of context coming from that pre-purchase experience, the cart, what the person has added, everything like that. And then you also have all the components that go into that purchase. So things like shipping options, things like tax, things like payments and payment processing, making sure the order is successfully placed in the ERP and shopping cart platform. And so it just sits at the center of a lot of complexity, which means it needs to work perfectly in sync with all of these different systems. And it's also an extremely high risk part of the process, right? If checkout breaks, that's really bad. If someone can't complete their purchase, that's a really, really bad experience. And so there's incredible kind of high risk. And then the last piece is where you're touching customer data, right? It's the time where you're touching PII, personally identifiable information. It's the time we were touching credit card information. So regulations like PCI in the US come into play. And so there's also regulatory risk involved, especially as things like privacy laws become more and more important, that retailers have to deal with and figure out how to optimize around, that they're not necessarily set up for or thinking about in other parts of their business.
And what about the payments, payment processing, bits of checkout? So it's pretty much outside of control of retailers, I would think.
Yeah, correct. It is something that's a bit outside of their control. They usually have a third-party vendor, and that connection between their kind of default checkout experience, as you mentioned in the beginning, that most retailers use, and their payment processor is really important, but is also something that people aren't really thinking about or spending a lot of time on. If you look at other industries outside of e-commerce, especially in high tech, people spend a lot of time optimizing that relationship and connection between actually entering payment details and processing those payment details. And it's something e-commerce hasn't necessarily spent as much time on at baseline. It's still a very simple experience. You go enter your payment details and send them to the processor and hope that the charge goes through. And there's still a lot of opportunity to optimize things like authorization rates and things of that nature in the actual checkout experience itself.
Okay. What kind of metrics should we sort of benchmark at checkout? So what are you seeing at Vault?
I think the most important thing is obviously conversion, right? You want to see for everyone who opens the checkout experience, how many of them are completing it. The challenge with that metric, though, is sometimes it can be impacted by other factors, right? So if you change your marketing, if you change what types of like your mix of customers coming to the site and have more ad-based customers coming to the site, you change the design of your site pre-checkout, that can affect how many people are entering the checkout experience and potentially having more lower intent people enter the checkout experience. And so that's why A/B testing is so important with checkout, right? You don't want to just look at your conversion and see how it's trending. You actually want to see when I make a change to checkout, what actually what was the actual impact of that change directly. What do we see from a conversion perspective when we compare apples to apples, the original experience versus the change? So that's the most important piece. I think in addition to that, there are what I'll call like proxy metrics that impact conversion. So things like the number of fields people have to enter on average, the amount of time it takes to go through checkout, the amount of time it takes to just load checkout, the number of users that are saving their payment information with your e-commerce store, how many users are reusing saved payment information. Those are all things that, although don't directly connect to revenue, are good early indicators of a positive e-commerce and checkout experience.
I absolutely agree. There's also the dimension of like measuring steps towards checkout and payment.
Yep.
So knowing the number of people who potentially have added to carts, and that transition, what percentage of people who are at checkout that have actually converted.
Yeah,
it's amazing. So it begs a question as to why retailers are not focused on at checkouts. They would optimize their product pages. They look at their search logs. They do A/B split tests, with designs and buttons and the like. But they kind of abandon the checkouts and just leave, most of the time at least from what I've seen, and leave the checkout experience as that standard out of the box experience, and hope and pray that everything kind of works out at the final frontier. Just why is it not a problem they're really focused on at the moment?
I think in majority, it comes back to that first question, which is the fact that it's really complex to change checkout. And so when you look at the opportunities retailers have to optimize, whether it be their ad campaigns or their product pages or their promotions, those things, especially with the existing kind of e-commerce toolkit that most retailers have, are a lot easier, right? They're things that feel like much lower hanging fruit. They're things that without like a strong technical team, you can go and make changes to and kind of change how your product pages are presented, change your images, change your buttons, things like that. Checkout is not necessarily like that, right? Because you're touching all these different systems, because you're collecting user information, it's much harder to change. And so you'll often see when you're going through, even at large retailers, a distinct difference once you reach checkout in their design and experience. It often looks a little bit older, right? It looks like it's a little bit more outdated. And that's because it's so hard to change without breaking things, that retailers and the kind of engineering and technical teams within retailers often kind of change it last. It's the last thing they update, if they update it at all. And the other component of that is the risk, right? When you're updating product pages and things like that, it's relatively low risk, right? It's something that is simple. It doesn't have a lot of complexity baked into it. And so you're very unlikely to break it. And if you do break it, it's bad, but I think that there are still opportunities for the shopper to complete their purchase in other ways. If you break checkout, like that, the buck stops at checkout, right? If you break checkout, the person can't complete the purchase. And so it's a kind of like a high risk, high reward type scenario that most retailers generally try to avoid. And especially retailers who've tried it in the past and had issues, right? If you try once and break checkout, you try once to optimize and break checkout, you're probably never going to try it again.
True. Okay. It's super interesting. So some research. So I guess some retailers or some retail platforms, e-commerce platforms will fix will not allow you change the checkout experience, while others are quite flexible with what you could do at checkout. Now, could you just break down the ecosystem, on what the ecosystem looks at the moment, and what platforms will allow you really customize your checkout and optimize it? And I love what you talked about in regards to the to the other micro conversion points or things that impact checkout. We talked about the speed, number of fields, and all of that. If like I wanted to reduce the number of fields on some e-commerce platforms, I just can't. It's just box standard. So let's talk about that ecosystem, and then let's get into the metrics and micro metrics we could adjust to speed up checkout process.
For sure. So within e-commerce and within kind of the shopping cart software space, right? It's a bit of a spectrum, right? You go from kind of the hosted platforms that are very out of the box and kind of customizable to a degree, but not like built from the ground up to be customizable. And then you go all the way up to like the enterprise solutions that you actually don't get that much out of the box outside of the kind of basics of e-commerce, and they're intended to be built on top of and customized. And on the kind of hosted end of the spectrum, you have shopping cart platforms like Shopify and BigCommerce. On the kind of enterprise end of the spectrum, you have shopping cart platforms like Salesforce Commerce Cloud, or NetSuite Commerce, or Magento, and things like that. I would say that regardless of platform, you usually have the option to kind of build checkout yourself, right? So you can always completely replace checkout, and that's what Bolt does in a sense. But that's a huge lift, and that's what usually on these more enterprise-facing platforms, merchants generally have to do, right? They have to go and build their own experience. And the benefits there is you can optimize that checkout experience. You can spend some time thinking about how to reduce fields, how to reduce clicks, how to reduce speed, or increase speed. But you have to actually do that work, right? And it's not something that is easy. It's something that can be highly complex. And so a lot of retailers gravitate towards these out-of-box experiences because they don't necessarily have the resources to be able to spend a ton of time on checkout. But I think to your second point, there are lots of opportunities even within these experiences, these e-commerce shopping experiences, to improve the experience, to reduce the fields, to speed things up. And I think a lot of those opportunities live around fields. So where you have opportunities to reduce fields, it's a great opportunity to drive up conversion. So thinking of every field in your checkout process, is it absolutely necessary for you to complete that purchase? And can you make the field optional? Can you remove it entirely? One unique thing that Bolt does, because we own the checkout experience and fraud prevention for our merchants, is we completely remove the concept of billing address. We don't believe for our purposes it's necessary to prevent fraud. And so we completely remove all of those fields that you have to enter in addition to your shipping address. And so there's opportunities like that from a field perspective. I think there's also always opportunities on speed, right? You can always try and get your load times down. You can always remove things from the checkout experience, like images and assets that are causing the page load time to increase. You can always reduce the number of steps so there's less redirects and load times. Yeah. And those are all things that kind of, regardless of platform, you have the opportunity to improve upon. And I think as e-commerce is shifting more and more towards mobile, those things become more and more important. Those things get amplified, right? If it takes me 2 seconds to load up a checkout on my desktop with a high-speed wired connection, when I'm out on the town kind of shopping on my mobile device, it's going to take me 10 seconds. And on mobile, I might get distracted and decide not to purchase just because it takes a while to load and completely forget about that purchase. And so that the stakes are a lot higher as e-commerce continues to shift towards mobile.
That's super interesting. Great points on fields and speed, for reducing fields and speed. From what I've picked up, you guys don't work with Shopify or with the Shopify ecosystem. Is that right?
That's correct. We do have a couple existing customers that are on Shopify, but we don't currently accept new customers on the platform, and that's largely because Shopify is pretty closed off as it pertains to modifying the checkout experience. It's against the terms of their kind of public app ecosystem, And so although it's possible, it's definitely not something Shopify has invested in supporting well. And so it was hard for us to offer like the level of experience we wanted for our customers within that kind of more closed ecosystem.
What about the likes of Salesforce, NetSuite?
So yeah, so we work with Magento, BigCommerce, Salesforce Commerce Cloud, Woocommerce. We are working on a partnership with NetSuite as well. And a large percentage of our customers are also, especially our more enterprise customers, are also on some form of kind of custom built solution, which we also support. So
like e-commerce
so some more of a headless experience that requires a bit more of a custom integration with Bolt, but it's still definitely possible and not too heavy of a lift.
From what you're talking about, you guys are primed to actually even evolve to a headless kind of solution, because the bot ends at stops at the checkout, so you just need to build the catalog management system. I'm thinking ahead here, but I digress.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. I think in general, when you look at the experience throughout the e-commerce workflow, when you're pre-checkout, what's most important is like flexibility, right? And that's what a lot of e-commerce platforms like Magento, for instance, which is so popular, are built around. It's like, how do we make this as flexible as possible so that merchants can build whatever type of experience they want with respect to their catalogs and their products and their product pages. When you get to checkout, the experience is what matters most, right? Being highly optimized, fast, easy to use. And so we actually think the types of like companies and products that are going to excel in those two spaces are different, right? And so we are really hyper-focused on that post kind of intent to purchase experience, that experience that kind of should be easy and consistent and seamless, regardless of where you're shopping. And we don't really have plans to extend before that experience, because we think that is something that the shopping cart platforms that exist today do solve really well, right? It's something where they give retailers a ton of flexibility. They give retailers a platform to build on top of. And that's not necessarily what Bolt as a product or a company is built to do.
Let's take a quick break to hear from our sponsors. Klaviyo is a growth marketing platform that powers over 25,000 online businesses. Klaviyo understands every single customer interaction and empowers brands to create more personalized marketing moments. Listen, analyze, and act on your customer data with Klaviyo. Visit klaviyo.com/2x.
So that's our perspective as it pertains to like where we see ourselves going longer term.
Okay, so on your website and in your marketing material, you claim to be the fastest checkout in the industry. Now, what benchmarks are you seeing? Because obviously you said you did a lot of product research and product development before actually going live. So what kind of industry benchmarks did you see, and how did you improve it to make a claim of being the fastest checkout in the industry?
Yeah, so there are two pieces to kind of that claim. I think one is looking at the common checkout experiences across the web. And what we did there is we actually created kind of a standard way of going through that checkout process and timed it. So if you keep all things equal, like type speed and the amount of time between clicking between fields and how long it takes you to click a button, and you factor in how many, like what the load time is on each of those pages, and like basically how long it takes to go between the fields, how many fields there are, we're 2 times faster than any other experience, like default experience in e-commerce, right? I think when we timed it, and these are metrics that are based on, I would say, a relatively fast checkout and type speed, but most experiences are over a minute long if you are kind of constantly entering information, and Bolt is around 30 seconds.
30 seconds, and for
first time guest checkout experience. And so that is kind of how we got to that number, right? It's obviously hard to know outside of doing something like that, how you stack up. I think the other piece of that is we also looked at even kind of major brands in the industry and what their overall time spent loading the checkout experience was when you go through the checkout on a standard internet connection. So for most experiences, right, they're like 2 or 3 pages, and each page reloads as you go to the next page. And when you add up all that load time, even on a desktop level internet connection, it's like ends up being 15, 20 seconds of load time. And Bolt loads near instantaneously. So our load time is under 3 seconds, and there are no redirects. It's a progressive web app. So you immediately transition to the next step when you click a button. And so that is another piece that really matters, especially on mobile, like I was mentioning earlier. Those seconds can be the difference between someone giving up on a purchase and saying, oh, I'll just do this later and never returning, or completing that purchase. And so that's been a really big focus for us is not just kind of the field and how seamless the experience is, but how quickly it can load, and how well we're kind of capturing that intent of that user.
Interesting. So it's like it's like a light box on experience when you trigger it with no redirect. So you're not taken to another page; it just pops up.
Correct.
As an agent.
Correct.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. That saves a ton of resources because it's preloaded anyway from the checkout page.
Yeah. Exactly.
Interesting. Okay. And you're mobile first, I think. Okay. So how many? So what was the industry standard from a form? I need to just address the audience now. They're asking you a question, but guys, if you just take what Greg has said, you need to start measuring page load times on your checkout pages. They have about 3 seconds, but that's something to really check out on in different scenarios. From a cellular, mobile standpoint, and what it look like in Wi-Fi. We run comparisons. Then also probably also start benchmarking time to check out, especially using tools like Hotjar and like so just get that average and start to benchmark it. Okay. Now my other question had to do with obviously you talked about the fact that it takes 30 seconds to load as a guest. Do you offer the user identity layer that will so recognize an email address or a mobile number, so people don't have to re-enter their, and like what Stripe does, so you don't have to re-enter their payment details and their information and their delivery details again over and over again when they encounter sites that run in Bolt.
For sure. So this is actually something we think is incredibly important. So if you look at kind of your standard e-commerce experience, a lot of time what retailers will do is before checkout, they'll put up a login wall, right? And it'll say, hey, like log in or create an account or like go through guest checkout. And we actually have seen that upwards of 30% of users can drop off just from that screen, right? They can see that screen and decide, hey, like, I don't want to, they maybe miss the guest checkout option or don't understand it. And like, I don't really want to create an account with this service. I'm going to drop. And so I think the most important thing as it pertains to saving information and creating accounts is that you don't make it a blocker to finishing the checkout experience, right? You don't add additional friction to that guest checkout experience to be able to save payment information. And so what Bolt does is at the end of the checkout experience, when we already have, because you entered it for shipping, your email, your phone number, your address, your payment method, we ask if you want to save that information with a simple checkbox, right? And so if you would like to save your information to reuse it, you can keep that checkbox checked. And what we do from there is when you click pay and you finish your transaction, we actually authorize that on your device. And that payment information and shipping information is saved associated with your device. So if you come back a few days later and want to buy something new, you actually will immediately receive a one-click checkout experience, right? You'll click on to checkout and see all of your payment information saved. If you come back much later or you're on a new device, when you enter in your phone number or your email address, will identify that you have an account and send you a one-time password over SMS, allow you to authorize and basically complete the purchase from there. And what we see in this case is, in terms of registration, we see about 60% of users saving their payment information on average, which is, there aren't great industry benchmarks on this, but from anecdotal evidence can be up to 10 times higher than kind of the average retailer, how much registration they're getting. And in addition to that, the adoption is really strong. So for most retailers, when we start, they see like less than 10% of their checkouts going through a logged in one-click experience. And as they roll out Bolt, that scales up, and we have retailers, on average, it's about 20%, but we have retailers upwards of 30, 40, 50% of their checkouts being a one-click logged in experience. And so we think that's the ultimate, right? That's the best possible experience for the customer is basically the checkout doesn't exist, right? It's something that I decide I'm going to buy something and I click buy and I'm done. Right? I don't need to enter any information. You already know me. You already have my information. And so that experience is something really worth striving for. However, you can't allow that to get in the way of a shopper who doesn't have their information saved and just wants to complete a guest checkout.
Yeah. So how many more seconds does it shave, as one-click checkout shave off the standard 30-second guest checkout time? Yeah.
So we see that it about halves it again. So and this is just looking at like actual time to check out across the two experiences. And essentially that time to check out is just purely deciding to make the purchase, right? Because you already have all your information saved. You don't need to enter anything. It's literally just clicking one button. And so it definitely shaves off quite a bit. I think in addition to that, we see that logged in users are upwards of 50% more likely to convert. So obviously when I have all my information saved and I don't need to re-enter it, it drives up conversion significantly. And so looking for opportunities as retailers to increase the number of kind of logged in checkouts without decreasing your guest checkout conversion is a really big opportunity.
And do users feel they're transacting with the e-tailer, or do they feel they're transacting with Bolt? So this, I'm trying to draw a parallel between when I check out with PayPal versus normal standard credit card.
So we're very retailer first, right? So the customer will see that like, hey, this is a Bolt checkout, it's secured by Bolt. But the primary branding, the primary experience is with that retailer, and we intend to keep it that way. We don't want customers to think there's a kind of big third entity that they're having to deal with and transact with. We want their focus to be on their relationship with that e-commerce retailer and not with the PayPal equivalent. And that's something that kind of differentiates us. We're more focused on the experience of wanting to save my information with that retailer than necessarily like a separate wallet that I have to go off to another page and sign into. All of this is within the context of that retailer's website, that retailer's experience.
And then, obviously all the PPI and PCI compliance requirements are outsourced to yourselves.
Correct. And I think another important part there is a lot of e-commerce, especially people on legacy shopping cart platforms, have been dealing with big challenges from a fraud perspective of basically credit card skimmers being entered into e-commerce experiences. And we've had a few customers who had to deal with that before adopting Bolt. And that's something that Bolt completely takes on for the customer, right? Because it's no longer kind of your site itself that is accepting credit card details. It's Bolt is taking on that responsibility. You no longer have to worry about that. We're in charge of making sure that doesn't happen for your customers, regardless of the platform you're on, right? So even if you're on a very legacy platform like Magento 1, we ensure that that's not an issue for you. And that's actually been a really big selling point for the customers who've experienced it. That's obviously a really, really bad customer experience. It's a really scary thing for retailers. And so for opportunities to kind of remove that risk, retailers are really excited about that piece.
Some experts purport that having trust sales, secure, having like a secure, a secure logo on your checkout, and trust sales. A lot of people have notes, and a lot of brands have notes in secure and McAfee at their checkouts. What are you seeing? Do they work? Are they worth the subscription fees? These third-party tools,
I think the core premise is right? In ensuring that your customers, both like one, ensuring that your customers have a secure experience and telling them that that experience is secure does pay dividends from a conversion standpoint. Whether that be from your own reassurances to the customer or a third party, we haven't necessarily seen a big difference. Right. And so I think the most important thing, regardless of whether you choose to use a Norton or a McAfee, or you choose to like ensure that security yourself and reassure your customers yourself, is just making sure that that's, especially when someone's entering sensitive information, especially credit card information, that they feel secure in that experience, and that they see that you guys, that you as the retailer have really high standards as it pertains to security. That's what's most important. And that reassurance can be the difference between, again, someone saying, yeah, like I've never bought something from this retailer before, I'm not sure, and feeling comfortable to enter that information on that retailer.
Yeah. On the front end, is Bolt doing any sort of marketing on the consumer end for more or less to build this security and trust from their perspective? So once they see the Bolt logo, they subconsciously are just rest assured that the checkout is going to be smooth, fast, and secure.
I don't think we've reached that point yet. I think we're still really focused on the retailer and the retailer's experience and augmenting that experience. I think over time, we hope that organically and also through a bit of marketing, that when people see that the retailer has the Bolt checkout experience, they are just inherently more likely to convert because they know it's going to be easy, they know it's going to be secure, they know they're potentially going to have their payment information saved. But that's not our focus today. Our focus is very squarely on the retailer and doing what's best for the retailer and making the experience within that retailer as seamless as possible. One thing that we are thinking about and trying to work through is, in the cases where Bolt is becoming more noticeable and kind of recognizable from a consumer's perspective, how do we let the consumer know earlier in the experience that this is going to be a Bolt experience, right, before they actually get to the checkout? And one thing that we're actually testing right now is the concept of an always available checkout button. So as you're browsing the site, instead of having to kind of go through your typical flow of like add to cart, view the cart, check out, having something that just is a floating button in the bottom right that I can always launch into checkout from anywhere. And when you look at experiences like Zendesk or Drift or Intercom that have that like chat experience always available, those have been really powerful, right? They've been, especially in e-commerce, really valuable for customers and building trust and rapport. And we think a similar concept can make sense for checkout. So that's something we're really excited about, both in terms of letting the customer know earlier that it's going to be a Bolt seamless experience, but also in terms of driving up conversion, making it easier for customers to check out.
Yeah, it's a really, really good point. I have personally experienced uplifts by just having like an Apple Pay on product pages. The only challenge with that is for more complex products where there's selection required. You'd have to sort of rethink the entire user experience. Where there's a selection and then that button probably just kind of appears for a buy now. But buy now button, no doubt, will increase conversions.
Let's take a quick break to hear from our sponsors. Did you know that cloud-hosted e-commerce platforms like Shopify and BigCommerce do not provide automatic backups? Rewind steps in to protect Shopify and BigCommerce stores with automatic backups. Rewind is trusted by over 25,000 stores. Install Rewind and get to test it for free over 7 days. And to extend the 7-day trial to 30 days, head over to rewind.io, their website, and mention 2x eCommerce.
We were talking about scale, as in one of the keywords I picked up at the start of this conversation was scale. You're delivering this reimagined checkout experience at scale. At what point from your data does it start to make sense to switch up to say, okay, I'm done with trying to do this myself as a retailer, and I just need to use a platform like Bolt. At what sort of transaction levels and in terms of like order frequency, not just order frequency, number of transactions, and also transaction volume, does Bolt start to make sense?
Yeah, so we focus on retailers doing over $10 million annually online. So that's kind of our threshold as to a minimum where it starts making sense. And I think for most retailers, it should be a relatively, not simple, but relatively easy kind of equation to think through, right? It's how much are you spending on checkout today? How much are you losing because of a suboptimal checkout on the other end? And what's the cost of the platform associated? And in a lot of cases, we can make the pitch, especially for larger retailers, almost purely on the cost of maintaining checkout, right? So if we take that completely over for them, those engineers can work on other things, or they don't need to hire SIs or contractors to work on it. And so that alone with the cost of Bolt can be ROI positive, let alone the incremental conversion and things like that. And how we like to think about it is checkout is something that if retailers are spending time on, they're all spending time on in silos, right? They're all doing kind of their own thing, optimizing on their own, but it's an experience that's pretty much consistent across every retailer outside of branding and colors and UX and UI styling and things like that, right? You enter your shipping details, you select a shipping option, you choose a payment option. And so by using a third party like Bolt, you're essentially leveraging all of the work we've done for our entire retailer base, and you're getting all of that benefit. So all of the costs that Bolt is incurring to optimize that experience and make it really seamless is amortized across a lot of retailers. And so from a financial economic perspective, it should make sense, of course, at a certain scale, for you to not have to do that on your own. And that's also what I mentioned earlier, what differentiates checkout from the rest of the e-commerce experience, right? The rest of the e-commerce experience is really about the brand. It's really about making sure that we're optimizing that experience for what we're selling, who we are as a company, and it's very bespoke to that retailer. Checkout is transactional. It should be simple, it should be consistent, it should be easy. And so it's a bit different from that earlier experience, and it's something that we feel makes sense to outsource.
Makes sense. So what are your fees like from your typical fees at that scale?
Yeah, so we have 3 products. So we have our checkout platform, we have our fraud solution, and we have payments. Our payment processing is kind of your standard fees, which are a percentage of volume plus a flat fee. For fraud and checkout, they're of course negotiated because we're dealing with larger companies, but it's generally a certain number of basis points of the total transaction volume. And it depends, fraud in particular depends on the riskiness. So we take on all the fraud liability when we sign up a customer for our fraud service. So we cover any fraudulent chargebacks that you end up incurring. And so it depends on kind of the level of risk that merchant has inherently. So unfortunately, we don't have like a great like rack rate that we can share, but it's on the order of kind of like basis points in terms of price.
There's a risk assessment involved on it.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, let's talk about fraud. What special fraud? Well, how can retailers, sort of avoid or reduce, fraud? And then we'll talk about, features and how you guys solve it.
Yeah, so I think that the important thing with fraud that I want to impress, that is how Bolt approaches it, is as a retailer, you shouldn't be just thinking about how to reduce fraud. You should be also thinking about the cost of reducing that fraud from a consumer experience, right? The easiest way to reduce all fraud is to never accept any orders, right?
They're inevitable. They will happen.
Yeah. And so you need to be thinking about not just how do I reduce fraud, but how do I also make sure that I'm not adding a bunch of unnecessary friction because of fraud. And how am I making sure that I'm not rejecting good customers who actually were valid in making a real purchase, and what I do for fraud is actually actually blocking them. And so I think the important pieces there are similar to checkout, making sure you're only capturing the information you actually need to make that fraud decision, and also making sure that you're not trying to avoid as much as possible like a rules-based approach. Right, because a rules-based approach where I say, hey, anything over this threshold or anything that looks like this, that has these specific parameters, I'm going to reject or send to review. One is really easy to game for the actual fraudsters, right? They're going to be able to figure that out and kind of work around those rules. And two is going to block good customers who aren't fraudsters, right? The people who are going to get blocked most by those rules are going to be the people who aren't trying to explicitly defraud you and are more just trying to make a purchase. And so I think that those two pieces I think are the most important when you're thinking about fraud, and really focusing on how do you approve more good orders, right? It's not about how do you reject more bad orders. It's really focused on like, how do we make sure we're approving as many orders as possible?
Sounds very manual to me. You need to automate it at scale. Yeah. Right. So what do you guys do? You know, obviously you've given us the approach and everything. Well, how do you do it at scale?
Yeah. So what makes it built a bit unique is that we believe fundamentally fraud and checkout need to be very interlinked, right? The experience in checkout impacts your ability to do fraud. Your kind of fraud protections impact the checkout experience, right? If I'm rejecting people, that's a bad checkout experience. And so what we do uniquely is because we own the checkout experience, we have a ton of behavioral signals, right? We have how you're passing through that checkout experience, what your type speed is, where you're clicking. And then we have all that data normalized because it's a consistent checkout experience across retailers. And so we leverage a machine learning algorithm that largely focuses on that data. And it still looks at the traditional fraud data, right? The AVS response code and all the information from the payment processing standpoint. But the real focus is on that behavioral data. And that's generally what we use to make the decision. And that's what allows us to remove things like billing address, right? Because billing address for us is more of a rule-based system, right? If I don't remember my billing address or accidentally click like same shipping and billing address when it's not, that's not necessarily an indication that I'm a fraudster, right? It's an indication that I made a mistake. And fraudsters generally can get access to a billing address relatively easily. And so that's something we feel is unnecessary. And because we have all that behavioral data, we can remove. And so our process is, person goes through checkout, our fraud model tries to approve as many of those transactions as possible. So it approves roughly 90 to 95% of transactions immediately, just based on the machine learning model. Those transactions that aren't approved get sent to a manual review team. So it's another pass at trying to approve the order, right? We're like I mentioned, very focused on approving more orders. If that team can't approve the order, a lot of times we'll send a micro authorization to the customer's credit card. So we'll say, hey, we've sent some amount between $0 and $1 to your credit card. Type in that exact amount to prove that you own that credit card, and you can log into that account and we'll approve your transaction. So that's the third layer of trying to approve the transaction. And then if all of that fails, the retailer still has the final say. So if they go in and say, hey, actually, like, I know this customer, or I've talked to them on the phone and I feel that they're a real person who's trying to purchase something legitimately, they can always approve the transaction. And we're always looking for incremental steps on top of that where we can approve more, right? So our focus, like I mentioned earlier, is really like how do we approve as many transactions as possible? Because our focus as a company is conversion, right? Our focus is checkout. Our focus is that experience. And so our lens on fraud, why we do fraud, is because we see fraud as an opportunity to increase conversion.
Yeah. What about, how do you manage international transactions?
Yeah, so today we're focused on US-based retailers, but we do also, for US-based retailers, handle their international transaction volume. And so that is processed in a very similar way. Right now, because the volume for us is relatively limited, we don't have like separate models on the fraud side or anything for international. We use the same process for both. But as we scale, we're likely going to be working on incremental models specific to certain countries, because the fraud patterns can be pretty different on a country by country basis.
The reason I'm asking is when you're talking about like some of the methods of the authentication, and one of them is like sending special codes to bank accounts.
Let's take a quick break to hear from our sponsors. Klaviyo is a growth marketing platform that powers over 25,000 online businesses. Klaviyo understands every single customer interaction and empowers brands to create more personalized marketing moments. Listen, analyze, and act on your customer data with Klaviyo. Visit klaviyo.com/2x.
There was a European regulatory requirement, which just passed last year, I think.
Yep.
MasterCard came over on our show to talk about. It's called Strong Customer Authentication, PSD. What that does is it just sends you a text message either to your banking app to authenticate randomly, or a text message to your phone, and then it's like a two-step sort of authentication. But it doesn't happen all the time, which is convenient, kind of bearable from a consumer UX standpoint. It'd be interesting to see how that translates in the US in the future.
I think it's super interesting, and I think a lot of times we feel some of those regulations go too far, right? They're trying to add too much friction to the experience unnecessarily, and so we're looking at how we leverage those systems, which are great in a lot of cases, right? If I otherwise really can't approve this order, having a means to give the customer an option to prove their validity is really valuable. But we also want to make sure that they're not overused, right? I think a lot of retailers are potentially thinking about overusing them just because they're so scared of fraud, right? They don't want to risk any fraud. But a lot of times that leads to customers getting blocked, or customers not being able to do it, or hey, I don't have access to my banking app right now, or I forgot my password. And that can be a really challenging experience for the end customer.
Absolutely. There's a huge fear in the e-commerce space as to what that would mean before the directives came to play. And how, I don't know whether there was any lobbying involved, but how it eventually evolved was not every transaction required authentication. If it did, conversion rates would have
exactly
just gone down very, very right. Okay, so you're head of product at both checkouts. What does your product roadmap look like going forward? What does this feature look like? How would you further reimagine checkouts at both perspective?
It's a great question. I think there are a few different components that we're focused on right now. I think first and foremost, we're spending a lot of time on personalization. So, and personalization from the aspect of both the shopper. So how do we make the checkout experience more cognizant of the shopper, what they're buying, to make it the best experience for them. So thinking about things like when to offer discount codes, what shipping methods to offer at what price, what payment options to show them, and things like that are really things that are personal choices or matter at a personal level. Thinking about how we leverage a lot of the same learnings we have on the fraud side from a machine learning perspective and bring those into the checkout experience to provide a more targeted experience to that end customer. I think the other side of personalization is personalization for the merchant, right? There is no one global checkout experience that will convert best for every merchant, right? Every merchant is different. What they're selling is different. And so we're working on ways to be able to optimize that experience, not just globally, but at the merchant specific level. So having essentially a suite of tests and changes to the checkout experience, so we can go to a retailer and test really quickly and determine, hey, what's the best configuration that's going to convert the best for you and drive up conversion, not just at baseline with a really good checkout experience, but at a retailer specific level as well. So that's one component. I think the second component is, sorry, go ahead. Did you have a question? You're muted, sorry.
What verticals are starting to emerge in the landscape?
I still can't hear you, unfortunately.
Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, now I can.
Yeah, okay, sorry. So what verticals are starting to emerge? Are you starting to see that require very custom checkout experiences?
I wouldn't say there's necessarily any specific vertical, but I think some of the factors that matter are things like the demographic you're servicing, right? So that matters. The type of products you're selling. So if I'm selling like really expensive things, it's going to be a different checkout experience than if I'm doing fast fashion. And so factors like that, I think will impact. But our goal is not necessarily to build like a theme per vertical. It's more so to build the infrastructure to be able to determine very easily and quickly for one individual merchant, what's the best checkout experience going to be. Because we think all of those factors can intermix, and it's not necessarily going to be cut and dry which configuration is going to be best. Maybe we'll have an opinion on like where to start, right? Based on what the retailer is doing, what they're selling, but we don't want that to influence what the right experience is for them.
Okay. Sorry, I cut you short. You want to talk about the second point?
Yeah. Really quick, two additional points in terms of where we're going. I think the second is the post-purchase experience is something we think there's a lot of opportunity in. So tracking shipment, managing orders, it's something that, again, a lot of e-commerce retailers, because the account experience is so hard, and because it's just generally a big challenge to build those types of experiences in a seamless way, we think there's a lot of opportunity to help there as well, in building a really seamless, like end-to-end, what we call buying experience. So from checkout to tracking your shipment, potentially even things like returns. So that's a big focus for us moving forward. And then the third piece is really just expanding what we can support as a platform, right? So the third parties we support, things like more and more alternate payment methods that are popping up. And those are things that, or more shipping options or things like that. Those are things that retailers generally have to deal with and build on their own. And they're also things that are really hard for retailers to test and know the actual like impact of. And so we want to help retailers in that perspective too, to say, hey, when I add this alternate payment method, maybe an installment offering or PayPal or whatever, what's the actual impact in terms of conversion, in terms of revenue? And those are things we can help the retailer do by running a test within the bulk checkout experience to say, hey, half of shoppers will see this installments offering, half won't. And let's actually see, for the amount you're paying for that installments offering, like what am I getting out of it in terms of conversion? So those are questions we want to help retailers answer over time as well.
Incredible. Yeah, and the future obviously is mobile payments. So I guess most of the focus really is mobile. What percentage across the board? This is quite a broad question. Are you seeing people checking out on their mobiles now?
Right now, it obviously depends on the start and the end, right? More people are starting checkout on mobile. I think it's like 60 or 70% often in a lot of cases. But the actual conversions are usually around 50-50 because conversion is lower on mobile, the actual transactions. But we're seeing that grow. And we also see that very heavily from merchant to merchant. Right. So depending on what you're selling and kind of also what your marketing strategy is, the amount of transactions that are happening through mobile differ quite broadly. But we're seeing even on retailers that sell like super expensive watches or like truck parts, mobile is a big deal, right? People are shopping on mobile more and more. It's not just kind of the fast fashions, the millennial type products that are leading to mobile based purchases. Everyone's shopping on mobile, everyone's moving to mobile. And it's something retailers really need to think long and hard about, like not just checkout, but how their end-to-end experience works on mobile, and making sure that it's built for mobile from the bottom up.
Incredible. Greg, I could go on, for the rest of today, on and on for us, but it's been very insightful having you on, and giving us some perspective on what checkout should look like and should pretty much be optimized for. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
For people who want to check out the Bolt platform, it's BOLT, just bolt.com, you just have a look at it. Thank you.
I appreciate it. Thanks.